Good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be in the company of Mr. Amitav Ghosh today. My name is Vidya and this is Benedict Paramanand, the founder of the Green Literature Festival and Sustainability Next. And I curate the general fiction and non-fiction books and awards at Green Literature Festival. We are here with Mr. Ghosh this morning to celebrate the release of his new book, Smoke and Ashes, and also to chat with him about environment, sustainability, and writing on these issues. We all know that Mr. Ghosh became the first writer in English to win the Jnanpith Award in 2018, one of India's most prominent literary prizes. But I also want to say that two of Mr. Ghosh's books, Gun Island, won the GLF Honor Book Award in 2021 in the general fiction and non-fiction category. And in 2022, the Nutmeg's Curse was longlisted for the same Green Literature Festival Honor Award. Such a pleasure to be chatting with you this morning, Mr. Ghosh. Hello and welcome.
Hello, Vidya. Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure for me to be talking to you.
So we'll start off with, Smoke and Ashes, which released on July 15th. You focus on opium poppy and you talk of it, you've researched extensively on opium poppy in the course of your Ibis trilogy, and you talk about it as the plant, the single plant that is responsible for the unmaking of our world, in your words. Would you like to tell us a little bit about how and why?
Well, sure. I would say, actually the sentence that you quote is the opium poppy was responsible for largely responsible for the making of the world as we know it, and it's also going to be responsible for the unmaking of that world. What I mean by that is that actually the opium poppy played an enormously important part in the Indian economy, but also in the global economy. If you just think of the fact that, let's say Singapore. Singapore basically came into being to handle the China trade in the 19th century. And by China trade, the great bulk of the China trade was in fact the opium trade. The same is true of Bombay. Bombay became the major opium exporting port in India. The same is true of Hong Kong. Hong Kong was the major receiving port after its foundation, became the major receiving port for opium. Also true of Shanghai. When you think of these four cities, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Singapore, Bombay, these are absolutely foundational to the modern globalized economy. When we talk about globalism, that is what it is.
That's right.
And these four cities, I don't know, they're probably four of the busiest ports in the world. And I don't know what share of world exports, world seaborne trade go through them, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was as much as 50%, So, when you look at the importance of opium, it's literally that. It's brought, not only did it bring these cities into being, it brought into being many of the biggest corporations.
East India Company.
Well, the East India Company to begin with, but some of the most important banks.
That's right.
That exist today.
And you trace it in your book.
I do, yes,
You're
exactly.
talking about how the big MNCs came into this trade, or rather became big MNCs once they came into this trade, essentially.
That's right.
So you don't leave it there. For people like us who don't know much about history, it's a learning for us. But I think what you say is how it continues to ruin the world and.
Today we can see that the United States is facing a very, very major opioid crisis. Drugs have become also very important in the criminal underworlds of Europe. So we are seeing,
including India.
Here in India, if you look at the crisis that we currently have in Manipur, opium has played a large part in that, So all around we are seeing, really this incredible ability that opium has, to undermine structures of governance, to create corruption of various kinds. And this happens universally. You can't point a finger only at one country. In the 19th century, Westerners used to say China is essentially corrupt. This is why opium circulates there. But we now see that, in fact, this is also true of the West.
So yesterday I was at the BIC, your book launch. One big takeaway for me was that you said that the anti-opium movement has been relatively successful, and what climate movement can learn from that. So can you elaborate that?
Sure. The anti-opium movement, which started in the 1880s, it was a movement of basically what we today might call NGOs, civil society movements of various kinds. And they were they were arguing for the imposition of controls on the circulation of opium. At that point, the people who controlled the flow of opium were these enormous empires. The British Empire, the Dutch Empire, the French Empire, and so on. So, it was a struggle that was, a David and Goliath kind of struggle, because just as, climate activists today are fighting energy companies, those activists back then were fighting against these massive, powerful entities, these empires. But they ultimately succeeded in bringing these empires to the negotiating table and made them accept controls on the flow of opium. And they succeeded in this by creating transnational coalitions. Again, those movements were largely led by women. So there are many similarities, that we can see. And back in the 1880s, international communications were not easy, and yet they managed to mobilize on a large scale. So I think that's a model really for climate movements.
Greta Thunberg a few years back really brought it up, made it quite big, and especially among the youngsters. Do you think it's losing steam in recent months?
No, I don't think so. If anything, I think it's gathering steam.
I think so too. Yeah.
Because Extinction Rebellion, Fridays for Future, Just Stop Oil, all these organizations have, I think, become much more visible of late. And you have to also reckon with the incredible repression that they are now facing.
That's right.
We saw here what happened to Disha Ravi.
That's right.
For absolutely nothing.
Yes, to be taken away.
To be taken away to jail. For what? For literally nothing.
Which made no
sense. Similarly, we are seeing now, especially in the United Kingdom, they've enacted these unbelievably draconian laws. That allow them to crack down on protesters for no reason at all.
We had Disha Ravi speak at our fest last
I'm glad to hear that. So we are seeing this incredible repression happening, around the world, and in the face of that, I think actually more and more activists are coming together.
As must rightly be the case. The book is also a part memoir. Smoke and Ashes is also a part memoir. You talk, I remember reading a segment where you talk about how your father tells you about the cultivation of opium in Chhapra.
It's exactly the opposite.
Is it the stories? Are they stories?
It's exactly the opposite. He did not tell me about that.
Oh, is it? All right. But about how it made and unmade people's lives in Chhapra. There were, the cultivation of opium in. So is that, what I wanted to ask you was sort of looking inward. Is that also a way of, looking outward for you? When the book is a part of a memoir, it's also telling the history of the world while you're reflecting on your personal history, isn't it?
Yeah, I think to some greater or lesser degree, certainly north of the Vindhyas, the opium trade of the 19th century touched upon every family's life. in one way or another. So this is in a sense, what my book is trying to do is to show that, the strange ways in which this flower really molded individual lives.
Mm-hmm. Including touching your own family in some ways?
It's speculative, but my family moved from what is now Bangladesh to Bihar in the 19th century, mid-19th century. And they moved to Chhapra, which is a small town, but Chhapra also happens to be the district headquarters of Saran district, which was one of the largest opium producers. So, the entire economy there must have functioned around opium.
I see. Yes.
So where's the green literature writing headed, according to you? Is it getting much more popular? A lot of people are reading, and I'm sure your Great Derangement must have sold at least 100,000 copies. So,
I don't know how much it's sold. I don't follow those things. I think you can go mad if you try to keep up with that sort of thing. But I think certainly the book had an enormous influence. It had an enormous impact. Because, for example, Fridays for Future often reaches out to me, Extinction Rebellion also. And I try and support them in some small way, as best I can. If I'd been like 30 years younger, I would probably have tried to join some activist group, but it's not really possible for me now. But I fully support what the young activists are trying to do. But apart from that, you were asking me about whether the book played a part. Certainly, there's much more writing about these issues now than there used to be. I can tell you from my own experience. I get like 2 or 3 manuscripts sent to me every week.
Wow.
On these subjects. And they write to me and say, your book inspired us to write this book, so now you have to read the book. Which of course it's impossible. I read some of them, I try, but it's impossible to completely keep up. So I do think there's a lot more writing today. That's self-evident.
Yeah.
It's partly because the impacts of the environmental crisis are just so
large.
they're just so. You can't ignore them anymore.
That's right. That's right. Young people absolutely overwhelmed by climate change. They are going to inherit this world in a way, and it plays such a significant role in their everyday lives, really, right? So often, and most of your books are sort of cautionary tales, right? Here too, we're talking about, in the context of opium poppy, you're saying that it was not free trade, that sort of, they were not good market practices that have shaped the economy. They are more monopolistic, capitalistic practices that have shaped the economy. And in a sense, I felt you are telling us, to look at the present state of economy, the present state of big companies running our world. Is there a particular reason that you tell these cautionary tales?
Yeah, I think, there's a whole mythology about capitalism.
That's right.
There's this huge mythology about it, it's all put together by these brilliant entrepreneurs and so on. And this mythology is completely unfounded. So many of these, of the most successful capitalists, they began by peddling opium.
That's right.
So many of these multinationals. And I think we have to remember this history because it's perfectly clear today that kind of unrestrained capitalism is destroying the world and is going to destroy the world.
Do you think there's hope for this conscious capitalism and all that's coming?
Absolutely not. I think the only way that we can do this, that the only way of constraining these companies is by collective action.
Yes.
Imposing certain constraints. Look, throughout history, people have embarked on business enterprises. But they always also took for granted that there were certain ethical constraints.
That's right.
There were certain things you could do and certain things you could not do. what happened with this ideology of free trade in the 19th century was that it removed those ethical constraints.
Absolutely.
And that's the problem we're facing. You know, if you think of these big energy companies, you know, they sponsored the research on climate change. They knew what fossil fuels were doing, you know, to the planet. And yet they hid that knowledge. They continued to continuously grow. So, you know, that comes exactly from this, from the removal of all ethical constraints on business.
So, Vidya used the word cautionary tales. I think some would even say you are a doomsday kind of a person, they may give a tag. So, as part of book reviews that we do in Sustainability Next, I've come across many books now in recent years, means last 2, 3, 4 years. They, like Superabundance, if you've heard of it, or my Bloomsburg book as well. So they are projecting that the world is getting better. Here the human beings are healthier and things like that. So how do you look at that? Are they genuine or are they greenwashing? What do you...
Yeah, I think a lot of it is greenwashing. You know, obviously many people have a huge vested interest
That's right.
in pretending that all is well and that we can just carry on as usual, you know. Clearly they have, you know, they've grown rich from this world, and by pretending that all is well, they can grow richer and richer. So, you know, when you think of the ways in which people put this stuff out, I mean, in fact, a lot of the statistics that are quoted on the reduction of global poverty are essentially all out of China. You know, what China did is, you know, has never been replicated. China, you know, so that is never acknowledged, you know. And the sorts of constraints that China adopted in order to do that, the one-child policy and so on, you know, so the Western commentariat will at the same time denounce China for this and that.
That's right.
And at the same time, you know, quote these statistics which come entirely out of the Chinese experience.
Just the last two small questions. One is, because we in Green Literature Festival try to target the youth, get as many children and youth into reading and writing. So what would be your advice to youngsters to take up writing? What should they look at?
I think they should just look at the reality around them. And you know, if they look at that reality with clear eyes, they'll see what's happening. You know, our forests are, now this latest Forest Act is going to devastate our forests, what's left of them. You know, so they just need to just observe what's happening in the world.
I think the new forms of writing, not just books are very difficult to write and make it marketed. So new forms of writing and social media and all that, I guess that would be more impactful.
Well, they can be impactful in two ways. One is that they can be impactful in communicating the state of the actual state of the environment, but they can also be used to create propaganda, you know.
That's right.
Denialist propaganda.
But let's say writers as a catalyst for change. I mean, you have a 40-year history and so many wonderful books. Do you think, you know, they impact younger people? And writers as catalyst of change. I mean, I grew up reading your books. And I really mean it. Some of my career choices have been influenced by what you've written. Do you think it...
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for saying that, Vidya. It is true that, you know, when I do these public events, a lot of young people come.
That's right.
And a lot of them say that my books have had that impact in their lives, for which I can only be grateful, you know.
We are just going to be 3 years Green Literature Festival, and if you are our advisor, what would you tell us? How can we take it forward in a more meaningful, impactful way?
I've attended many festivals, but I've never organized one, so I really don't know how to advise you on that. I would be the worst possible advisor.
But do you think there are other Green Literature festivals outside India? I've not heard.
Yes, there are many.
There are many. Okay, in India, we are the only one so far.